The US has introduced a new airborne strike weapon that has the Russian military panicking because they can't stop it. It's not a new hypersonic missile, directed energy weapon, or other multi-million-dollar ultra-advanced system, although the Russians are distraught about the latest US iterations of those systems as well. Rather, the weapon in question, the Lucas one-way strike drone, is one of the cheapest strike weapons in the vast US arsenal, and Russia already has a well-established analog of its own. But the Lucas has a feature that could turn out to be the decisive factor in the war in Ukraine and in a major clash between Russia and the US or NATO. And to say that the Russians are alarmed about it is putting it mildly. So let's take a closer look at the Lucas, that special feature, and how it might change the face of warfare as we know it. First, Lucas stands for Low-Cost Uncrewed Combat Attack System, made by innovative US defense contractor Spectre Works in Arizona. It's the latest addition to the US's growing array of advanced unmanned weaponry. It made its combat debut during the US and Israel's assault on Iran on February 28, having been revealed the previous July and first showcased in December. On the face of it, it's a bit baffling why the Lucas has the Russian military blogosphere in such a flap. The drone joins a growing arsenal of low-end US unmanned strike aircraft, including the Raytheon Coyote, Anduril Roadrunner, Switchblade 600, and at a stretch, the BAE Systems APKWS-2, a laser-guided rocket conversion kit for 70mm Hydra 70 unguided rockets. Like these systems, and as its name indicates, the Lucas is designed to be a low-cost airborne strike weapon. Navy Captain Tim Hawkins described it as follows: costing approximately $35,000 per platform, Lucas is a low-cost scalable system that provides cutting-edge capabilities at a fraction of the cost of traditional long-range US systems that can deliver similar effects. Nothing is surprising there. The war in Ukraine has demonstrated unambiguously the impractical cost-to-kill ratio of using high-end expensive missiles to shoot down much cheaper kamikaze drones. A Tomahawk missile costs an estimated $2 million, a Patriot PAC-3 interceptor missile around $4 million, an AGM-158 JASSM ER missile $1.2 million, and even a Switchblade 600 drone cost around $120,000. Compared to those, $35,000 for a Lucas is vastly more affordable. They're also much quicker to churn out than any of the aforementioned missiles, making stockpiles easier to grow and replenish. So, it's not the use case that's so innovative. In fact, superficially, the most distinguishing feature about the Lucas seems to be that it's a rare modern example of the US reverse engineering a weapon system from a major adversary. That adversary is Iran, and the Lucas is a reverse-engineered version of Iran's notorious Shahed 136 drone. That's notable because historically, it's usually been the other way around. As early as the 1970s, Iran reportedly reverse-engineered its Tufan anti-tank guided missile from the US's BGM-71 TOW missile. Its Almas family of advanced missiles was developed by reverse-engineering Israeli Spike MR missiles captured by Hezbollah in Lebanon during the 2006 Lebanon War. Iran is also believed to have built at least 5 radar-evading drone models, like the jet-powered Shahed 171 Seamorg, by reverse-engineering a Lockheed Martin RQ-170 Sentinel drone. The drone had strayed over the border from Afghanistan and landed in Iran in 2011. The Shahed 136 was almost certainly the product of Iranian reverse engineering itself. It appears to be derived from the Israeli IAI Harpy anti-radar loitering munition, which in turn was derived from a 1980s-era German design called DAR, short for the Drone Anti-Radar, or the anti-radar drone. Now, the US has turned the tables by reverse engineering Iran's most widely used contribution to modern warfare, the Shahed 136. And just to rub the irony firmly into Iran's face, the first use of the Lucas in combat turned out to be against Iran itself. Back in May 2025, President Donald Trump had praised the Shahed's quality and cheapness to produce, calling it very good and fast and deadly. He criticized US manufacturers for not being able to manufacture an equivalent. Then, the US seems to have obtained a down version from Ukraine and reverse-engineered it. Russia has been tormenting Ukraine with large-scale raids by Shaheeds and its domestically produced Geran analog since 2022. Ukraine has brought down thousands, however, and at least one intact Shaheed seems to have been transferred to the US. The result is the Lucas, more or less a US analog of the same drone. The Lucas first appeared as a SpectreWorks drone design called the FLM-136. The number is a clear reference to its Iranian roots. While the exact specifications of the Lucas have not yet been made public, the FLM-136 has a stated maximum range of 444 nautical miles and can stay aloft for up to 6 hours. Its total payload capacity, excluding fuel, is 40 pounds, and it cruises at a speed of around 74 knots with a dash speed of up to 105 knots. The Lucas's specs likely match or exceed the prototypes, but those are roughly the same specs as the original Iranian Shaheed and Russian Geran, and they're in some cases inferior. For example, when Iran debuted the Shaheed 136 in 2021, its estimated range was 940 to 1,240 miles, 2 to 3 times greater than the FLM 136, and Russia has subsequently introduced more advanced versions of the platform from its massive factory in Alabuga, Tatarstan, including the jet-powered Geran 3. That means the Lucas is hardly an unknown quantity for the Russians. Russia has launched an estimated 50,000 Geran Shaheed drones at Ukraine since 2022, after all. So, what is it about the Lucas that has the Russian military brass in a cold sweat? In a nutshell, Starlink. Soon after the news of the US's use of Lucas drones against Iran broke, Russian military bloggers began sharing footage released in December by the Pentagon of a Lucas C-based test launch. In that launch, the US Navy had test-fired a Lucas drone from the Independence-class littoral combat ship USS Santa Barbara. The bloggers honed in on a telltale communications box on top of the drone. The box is clearly a terminal for Starlink, or even worse for Russia, the US's specialist military satellite communications network, built on top of Starlink called Starshield. Influential Russian Telegram channel Rybar, which has over 1.5 million subscribers, succinctly summed up the overarching concern. What was inevitable has happened. Starlink terminals have been installed on American Geran-like Lucas drones, allowing jam-resistant communication anywhere in the world where Elon Musk's network operates. What does that mean? Well, according to Rybar, the effectiveness of enemy drone strikes will increase by an order of magnitude. The Obsessed with War channel was just as concerned. What do we see? They wrote. A Starlink receiving antenna, which will allow the drone, if it's not shot down, to be guided precisely to its target while remaining connected until the very last split second. Now, Starlink has already increasingly become a word that causes smoke to come out of Russian President Vladimir Putin's ears. Starlink has long been at the core of Ukrainian military communications, especially on the battlefield. During 2025, Russia had increasingly been piggybacking on the Starlink system, even introducing Starlink-guided Geran drones. That came to an abrupt halt when Starlink pulled the plug on Russian Starlink connectivity in February, ending Russian experiments with it, causing chaos as communications crumbled, and leading to a stalled offensive and vigorous Ukrainian counterattacks. But effective as it is as a communications tool, in terms of drones, its greatest value is that Starlink-guided drones are practically jam-proof. Now, one of the primary methods of countering drones for both Ukraine and Russia is the use of electronic warfare, or EW, to jam the signals that guide them to their targets. Jam signals cause drones to miss, crash harmlessly, or even be redirected and captured by the opposing side. Most FPV and larger loitering kamikaze drones use GPS, or in the Russian case, it's GLONASS analog for guidance. So, both Ukraine and Russia have, as a matter of necessity, mastered the art of this kind of anti-GPS jamming EW and are constantly refining their capabilities. According to legendary Ukrainian electronic warfare specialist Serhiy Bezkresnov, also known by the call sign Flash, The Russians, captured all types of our main UAVs as trophies. Of course, they studied all the electronics, communication systems inside our UAVs and navigation systems. But Starlink guided drones are a nightmare for EW systems because, as the Russian military bloggers confirm, they're much more difficult to bring down than GPS-guided drones. It's a question of signals. GPS, GLONASS, and other navigation-type satellites operate in medium Earth orbit, or MEO. That's around 12,500 miles above the Earth. There are also relatively small numbers of these satellites in orbit: 31 GPS, 24 GLONASS, 35 Chinese Beidou, and 25 of the EU's Galileo network, respectively. From such a huge distance away, they transmit relatively low-power navigational signals and over narrow bands. By the time these signals reach ground, they're weak, and that's what makes them relatively easy to jam. Jammers essentially produce signals in the same bands that drown out the GPS signal. If your jammer delivers more power than the GPS signal at the receiver, it can drown out the GPS signals and cause the drone receiving them to veer off course or crash. On a front line, as long as the one in Ukraine, you don't need huge signal-producing jammers for effective EW across a wide area. That's not how it works. What you really need is a range of jammers powerful enough to drown out GPS signals and spread out across the front lines. Russia's solution has been to develop a fleet of mobile, truck-mounted jammers like the R330ZH Zytel, 1RL257 Krashuka 4, and RB341V Lear 3. They've proven pretty effective against drones and even GPS-guided missiles like the JDAM, whose signals fall squarely within the Zytel's range. Now, those are the kind of details that make the military show stand out from other military-themed channels. Subscribe to the channel and make sure you enable notifications so you never miss out on the latest news from the most important hotspots on the planet. Now, Ukraine is constantly changing the frequencies it uses to guide drones, as is Russia, creating a never-ending game of measures and countermeasures as both sides adapt. Sometimes the drones of one side have the upper hand, while the other side figures out how to adjust its jamming countermeasures. Or, as the Russian commander Ishtuganov puts it, the enemy plays with frequencies. We reconfigure our electronic warfare systems. The enemy begins to suppress us with electronic warfare. We switch to other frequencies. All of this is made possible by the weak signals from those far-off MEO satellites. But Starlink is a different story entirely. It presents a problem for Russia that it currently, and the foreseeable future, has no means of countering. It's unjammable. Unlike navigation satellites, Starlink operates in low Earth orbit, or LEO. The satellites aren't thousands of miles from the Earth. They're orbiting at roughly 341 miles above the Earth. There are currently around 10,020 Starlink satellites in orbit. The magical 10K number was reached on March 17, 2026, after a Falcon 9 rocket launched from Space Launch Complex 4 East at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, placed 25 more satellites in orbit. Starlink has actually launched 11,529 satellites in total since May 2019, but some of these have been replacements for defunct, deorbited spacecraft. These satellites are hurtling around the Earth at close to 17,000 miles per hour, forming a mesh that blankets the Earth and creating almost ubiquitous coverage wherever you may be on the planet's surface. This creates two huge problems for Russia, or for that matter Iran, China, or any other adversary looking to bring down a Starlink-guided drone. Firstly, each Starlink terminal isn't receiving a signal from a single Starlink satellite like an old-school dish. It's constantly bouncing off different units in the mesh as they move across the sky. At any given moment, each terminal is likely to be switching between satellites across short windows of time. That means Russia doesn't just have to jam a single signal on a single vector, it has to hit the equivalent of a moving target placed on a moving network. Secondly, because Starlink satellites are much closer to the Earth than GPS satellites, the signal is much stronger at the receiver. So Russia needs a much more powerful jammer to interdict and drown out the signal. That's certainly not beyond Russia's capabilities for a solitary satellite link, even with the more powerful signal. But trying to jam an entire mesh of 10,000 plus satellites that are moving at speeds in excess of Mach 22 is a different level of problem entirely. At this point, it's also an unassailable one. Jamming drones is no longer a park a jammer truck near the front lines problem. You need a massive fleet of much more powerful jammers, especially if the terminal is using a directional antenna and modern signal processing, as the Lucas is likely to. Instead of jamming weak signals to solitary receivers, Russia now has to overpower frequency hopping, constantly switching multi-satellite link that changes the geometry before you can latch on. It's technically feasible at scale, but the scale required is almost certainly way beyond Russia's capabilities for the foreseeable future. Some Chinese military researchers ran simulations to assess how many jammers they would need to suppress Starlink connectivity over Taiwan. Suppressing that network would likely be a critical component in any successful Chinese invasion. The simulation concluded that it would require an optimal grid of at least 935 synchronized, high-powered airborne jammers to fully suppress coverage. Alternatively, if relying on lower-powered systems, China might need closer to 2,000 jamming drones to achieve a similar effect. Map that out onto Ukraine, where the front line is anywhere from 500 to 750 miles long, and Russia would likely need many thousands of truck-mounted jammers just to touch sides. Now factor in the millions of square miles inside its territory that Russia would need to protect from Ukrainian long-range Starlink-enabled drone strikes, and you can see how insurmountable the problem is. Starlink's use of spread spectrum modulation already makes it a much more complex process to jam signals than with GPS. This transmission technique distributes the signal across a wide range of frequencies in a pattern that shifts constantly, based on a cryptographic key shared only between the terminal and the network. What that means is, if you jam one slice, there's a good chance you just hit noise. Even if you gather enough units and the massive power required to jam the entire frequency spread, you still run into encryption and key-based modulation patterns that you can't predict without access to the underlying key management. And those, needless to say, are highly classified. The bottom line is that Russia would need an expansive fleet of much more powerful jammers than anything it's demonstrated in Ukraine. That's likely to cost hundreds of billions of dollars at a minimum. For a nation that's already struggling to fund its war, that's likely to be close to impossible. Bear in mind that EW equipment is far from being destroyed by Ukraine. In fact, the signals they give off make them, to an extent, low-hanging fruit for Ukrainian drone, missile, and artillery strikes. The independent website Oryx Spionkop, which tracks Russian equipment losses using a visual confirmation methodology, records at least 94 Russian jamming and deception systems taken out of action by Ukraine since 2022. So, not only would Russia have to mobilize gigantic funds, resources, and manpower to build the suppression architecture required, it would have to keep them active long enough to be effective. These issues would only be compounded if the US were using the Starshield network instead of Starlink. Starshield is a specialized network built by SpaceX specifically for the US military in 2022. According to a company spokesman, it offers additional security and encryption for government and military use in national security operations and uses satellites owned and controlled by the US government. The network incorporates at least 183 dedicated Starshield satellites featuring enhanced security, Earth observation sensors, and hosted payloads, alongside secure, encrypted communications over Starlink's existing infrastructure. If the US implements Starshield links on the Lucas, Russia's task in jamming them becomes even more impossible. The encryption, authentication, and key management of Starshield are more hardened and tightly controlled, making spoofing even more difficult and jamming much more expensive. But for Russia, it still gets worse. Much worse. That's because it's not just Lucas drones Russia has to fret about. Starlink or Starshield links could conceivably be installed on practically every missile and drone in the US arsenal, where aerodynamic constraints allow. Imagine Starlink-connected Tomahawks or HIMARS. The Russians have, and turned a sickly shade of green at the thought. As Russian military blogger Russian Engineer laments, all these long-range strike systems will be able to be controlled anywhere on the planet and achieve the same precision as FPV drones, literally through a window. This isn't just an evolution in military affairs, it's a genuine revolution, the Post notes. And it's hard to argue with that. So, what can Russia do about it? Over the years, there's been consistent fear-mongering that Russia is developing anti-satellite weapons that could take out hostile satellites in their orbit. But even if such weapons exist, the sheer size and speed of the Starlink network mean it would require vast amounts of time and money to make a meaningful dent. As prominent Russian blogger Dmitry Konanikin notes, forget the Soviet tales about nails scattered in orbit sweeping away satellite constellations. That might have worked against hundreds, but not tens of thousands of satellites. So, there isn't currently a solution, and the panic is tangible. Rybar demands that the Kremlin start developing means to destroy thousands of Starlink satellites now. This must be funded as the highest priority. However, where the money is supposed to come from, they don't specify. Obsessed with War gives a grim prognosis. If within a year we do not find a solution against this satellite constellation, then things will go very badly for us, they wrote. To be fair, Russia has been experimenting with Starlink jamming technology and may already have had some success. In 2024, the Ukrainian military began reporting outages in Starlink connections, with military officials attributing the disruptions to Russia, testing different mechanisms. Leaked US military documents suggest the disruptions might be due to a system called Tobol that was originally designed to protect Russian satellites from jamming. Russia also appears to be developing a newer, more sophisticated system called Kalinka. This system is specifically intended to detect and disrupt signals to and from Starlink satellites in order to interfere with Ukrainian drones and military communications. Andrei Bezrukov, the director of the Russian Center for Unmanned Systems and Technologies developing the system, told state media that the so-called Starlink killer could also detect communication terminals connected to Starshield. We'll have to wait and see whether these systems turn out to be effective or more like Russian tanks. But it may well be that Russia's and China's most effective response will be of the if you can't beat them, join them variety. Both nations are frantically trying to get their own Starlink analogs off the ground. Russia is developing Zorky, a domestic Starlink rival, with serial production of terminals set to begin in 2026 and plans for over 300 satellites by 2027. China, for its part, is developing laser and microwave-based anti-satellite technologies to counter Starlink and Starshield, and is also developing multiple large-scale satellite constellations. The Qianfan or Thousand Sails network already has about 100 satellites deployed, with a goal of 15,000. The Guowang or SatNet network is currently in testing, with a planned 13,000 satellites. And the Honghu 3 network, currently in the planning stages, is expected to ultimately have around 10,000 satellites operational. The US Space Force does wield the counter-communication system, Meadowlands and remote modular terminals that can jam adversary satellite uplinks and downlinks. But since these systems have yet to deal with Starlink-like Russian and Chinese threats, it's unclear how they'll fare against them. It smells like yet another high-tech arms race where the US holds a commanding lead, doesn't it? We'll of course keep following developments closely, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out. And if you're interested in how the war in Ukraine might play out in 2026, check out this video where we lay out the different scenarios. Thanks for watching.